think there's any parallel in the Passover being in type, redemption or regeneration, with it having a sheaf wave offering, that is the leaf and the stem and the grain together waved before the Lord, and that is a raw product or an unfinished, uneatable food, with that of the Shavuot Pentecostal wave offering of the completed, prepared, satisfying loaves of bread. You think there's any comparison there? You think there's any parallel there? Smith's Bible Dictionary says this, that the Feast of Pentecost may be regarded as a supplement to the Passover. Supplement, if you look at the word supplement, is combined, meaning one. It's a supplement to the Passover. Just as sanctification is a supplement to regeneration. Sanctification is a supplement to regeneration. In other words, the Passover experience isn't an experience at all if you don't have the Shavuot. If you don't have the Shavuot experience, you don't really have. If the experience is supplemented, if it's a combination of something and you only have one element, you don't have it. Like H2O, you know, you don't really have water unless you got both elements. That's it. You have to have both parts in God's salvation plan. You can't just say, well, I'm this part, and that's good enough. Not in God's salvation plan. Just as sanctification is a supplement of regeneration, it takes both graces represented in both feasts to constitute God's salvation plan. The third feast. Said all that, got to the third feast. Now here's where it gets a little muddier. The third feast. It's the last of the set times. It has to do with last things. In progression, in cycles, 7 is the last of things, isn't it? And so the fall festivals, the fall festival and the appointed times of God have to do with last things. The things we've been dealing with were first things. Now we're dealing with last things. The first things spoke to us in the first of our experiences, spiritually and also historically. But now we speak of the third feast, which is the last of the set times, and they have to do with the last things. Last things prophetically, both in the physical and the spiritual realm. We like to talk about the physical fulfillment of God's set times as far as eschatology goes. Yeah, we all get all excited about eschatology. Man, we can really get off on that. It's easier to grasp for one reason. It's just easier to grasp things in eschatology in the last times and the last things than it is to grasp the last things in spiritual things. I would suggest that we know a lot more about eschatology in regard to the practical, physical last things than we do about the spiritual last things. I'm going to give you a preview. I'll give you an overview, because there is no way that, number one, we could ever do anything in depth on the last things in regard to the fall festival and the appointed times of the 7th month. An in-depth thing would be way more than we have time for and way more than what I'm qualified to talk about. But I can give a pretty good overview of it, having 43 years of it, not of eschatology, but of the study of the last things. And the last things, I was going to say, but the church has not grasped the individual spiritual truths of His appointed times. I'm talking about the spiritual truths. No doubt, prophetically speaking of the set times of the last things, is the great sorrow in the last days of the nation of Israel with the recognition of Yeshua as their rejected atonement. Let's turn to Zechariah 12. Is that a last thing? Hey, if you know anything about eschatology, you'll have heard of Zechariah. Zechariah, the book of Zechariah, I think it's right before Malachi. Zechariah is one of the books that's mostly quoted by those who study the end times prophecy. And one of the end time prophecies that almost everyone is in unison with, believing, that is first related in the prophets, is this recognition of Yeshua by Israel. Is that right? In the last days? One of the last things in the last days has to do with Israel recognizing Yeshua HaMashiach. When they are recognizing Him, we are there. And if we look in Zechariah 12, verse 10, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. And then look at verse 13, chapter 13, 1. In that day there shall be a fountain open to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. In other words, that fountain that we sung about this morning, the fountain that flows from Yeshua's veins, that'll be open unto the house of David. The Jews are going to recognize Yeshua as their Messiah. That's one of the last things. So the fall festival and the fall appointed times speak to the last things. If you wonder, what's the fall things? The fall things point to the last things. It's not that difficult. Let's look at Romans 11. Romans 11:12.
Do you think that they're doing that in some part?
Yeah.
Now?
Yeah.
Starting to recognize Yeshua as their...
Yeah. Yeah, not like they're going to.
Right.
But there definitely are. There's always been a remnant. Paul said he was. He said, I'm a remnant. God has not forsaken His people entirely. There's always been a remnant.